The scene doesn't begin with desperation. That's the first thing most people miss. There is no bargaining, no pleading upward into the sky, no attempt to convince a distant power to intervene. The teacher stands near the stone, calm, present, almost annoyingly unhurried given the gravity of the moment. Others around him are emotionally charged, caught in grief, expectation, fear. But he is not performing for them. He is not asking permission. In this retelling, the teacher is called Aaron, and the man in the tomb is Kellen. The setting isn't ancient Judea exactly. It's slightly displaced in time, intentionally blurred, somewhere that feels both old and now. Stone still seals the cave, but the air carries the hum of a world that already knows too much and understands too little. Aaron doesn't speak to the sky. He speaks toward the tomb, but not as one speaking to a corpse. His posture says everything, upright, grounded, eyes steady, breath slow. Those watching expect a prayer. What they receive is recognition. This is the first hidden inversion. Most people are taught that power flows from begging upward. Aaron demonstrates the opposite. Connection is not something to be created in the moment of crisis. It either exists already, or nothing will work. What he is doing is not initiating contact, it's acknowledging continuity. He says Kellen's name, not loudly, not theatrically. He doesn't shout life into the cave. He speaks as if the connection was never broken in the first place. The words carry no strain. That's what unsettles the observers most. There is no emotional spike, no ritual buildup. Just certainty. And that certainty is the key most traditions later buried. Because the act isn't resurrection as spectacle. It's alignment. Aaron is not pulling Kellen back from somewhere far away. He is calling Kellen back into coherence with what already is. The tomb represents interruption, not finality. The stone is a symbol of imposed closure, not divine will. This is where the control structure begins to feel threatened. In the crowd are figures who understand systems, keepers of rules, interpreters of law, managers of what is allowed to be possible. They aren't offended by compassion. They are disturbed by competence. If this moment were framed as a miracle granted by favor, it could be managed. Favor can be regulated. Authority cannot. Aaron never frames what happens as a reward. He doesn't say Kellen deserved it. He doesn't say faith earned it. He doesn't even say the source chose it. That absence is deliberate. Because the moment you introduce worthiness, you hand power back to the system that decides who qualifies. Instead, Aaron operates as if life itself recognizes its own. As if calling is not persuasion but resonance. When Kellen emerges, confused, disoriented, very much alive, the emotional reaction is immediate. Shock. Relief. Awe. But Aaron doesn't linger in that energy. He doesn't soak in admiration. He doesn't explain himself. He simply tells others to help Kellen unwrap the bindings. That detail matters more than it seems. Aaron does not remove the grave cloths himself. The calling is complete, but the integration is communal. This is another piece often lost. Awakening doesn't isolate. It reintroduces. It brings the called one back into shared reality, not into special status. Those who witness this moment later argue about what happened. Some insist it was divine intervention. Others say deception. Others say it never happened at all. But the ones who were closest felt something subtler and more dangerous. They felt their internal hierarchy shift. Because if Aaron didn't ask, if he didn't negotiate, if he didn't submit, then the entire framework of mediation collapses. No priestly layer. No institutional gate. No delayed approval. Just direct recognition between source and being. That's why this moment gets reframed in later tellings as a one-time event. A special case. A proof of unique identity. Anything to keep it from becoming instructional. But Aaron's behavior betrays the truth. He acts as if this is reproducible. As if the principle matters more than the person. As if the demonstration is the message. Later, when questioned privately, Aaron doesn't give a theology. He gives an observation. He says that most people speak from need, not from alignment. They talk to the source as if it were absent. And absence cannot respond. He explains that recognition precedes command. If you don't know yourself as already connected, your words collapse under their own doubt before they reach anything. The system feeds on that doubt. It trains people to speak while internally believing nothing will happen. Aaron refuses that posture entirely. In this retelling, the moment at the tomb isn't about death. It's about interruption of authority. The stone was never the obstacle. The belief that separation is real was. And that's why, long after Kellen returns to ordinary life, the story continues to ripple. Not because someone walked out of a tomb, but because someone demonstrated that calling is not asking. That is the recognition that cannot be safely taught. What unsettles the observers most isn't that Kellen walks out of the tomb. It's what doesn't happen afterward. There is no collapse of Aaron's body, no visible cost, no dramatic depletion. He doesn't stagger or withdraw. He doesn't behave like someone who just spent a rare, exhaustible resource. He remains steady, as if nothing extraordinary occurred at all. That contradiction forces a quiet recalibration in the minds of those watching closely. Because the system they live inside teaches a specific equation, power is scarce, access is conditional, and intervention requires permission. Anything that violates that logic is labeled a miracle, precisely because miracles are meant to be exceptions. They preserve the rule by being rare. But Aaron never uses that word. In this retelling, he later refers to the event as a correction. Not a bending of reality, but a reassertion of it. He describes the world as layered with imposed limitations, agreements that are not natural but enforced through repetition, fear, and social reinforcement. When those layers are disturbed, reality doesn't break. It resets. This is where the idea of miracle quietly collapses. Aaron explains that what people call miracles are simply moments when the underlying order re-emerges long enough to be noticed. The system reacts aggressively to those moments because they reveal that the constraints people obey are not intrinsic. They are maintained. That's why the reaction from authority is so predictable. Soon after the tomb incident, Aaron is confronted, not publicly, not with accusations, but with concern. Polite concern. Questions framed as curiosity. How did you do it? Who taught you? Do you understand how dangerous this looks? Dangerous is the tell. If the event were just spectacle, it could be dismissed. If it were fraud, it could be punished. But if it were a system override, if it showed that alignment supersedes permission, then containment becomes the priority. Aaron doesn't argue with them. He doesn't need to. He simply refuses to explain himself in the language they expect. He won't reduce what happened into doctrine or technique that can be licensed. He won't turn it into a ritual others must request through intermediaries. Instead, he offers something far more destabilizing, a reframing of agency. He says that reality responds most cleanly when spoken to from coherence. Not emotion. Not desperation. Not belief as effort. Coherence. When thought, identity, and intention are not in conflict, command doesn't strain. It lands. This is the second inversion that threatens the structure. Because it removes the role of emotional intensity. People are taught that passion fuels power. Aaron shows that passion often introduces distortion. The system thrives on emotional spikes because they exhaust the speaker and externalize authority. Coherence does neither. Those closest to Aaron begin to notice a pattern. The moments of greatest impact are the quietest ones. No build-up. No ceremony. No anticipation. Just decisive alignment followed by movement. When asked why he doesn't prepare, Aaron says preparation implies absence. He doesn't prepare to be connected. He remains so. That statement alone would be enough to justify erasure. Because if connection is not something you enter but something you maintain, then the entire economy of spiritual access collapses. No waiting period. No initiation ladder. No dependency loop. And dependency is the backbone of control. Aaron never encourages rebellion. He doesn't incite overthrow. He doesn't target institutions. He simply behaves as if they are already obsolete. That's far more dangerous. Systems can suppress opposition. They struggle to suppress irrelevance. When others attempt to imitate what they saw at the tomb, they fail, not because the principle is false, but because they attempt it from imitation rather than recognition. Archon doesn't correct them publicly. Privately, he tells them that copying behavior without internal alignment is just another performance. The system actually prefers that. Performative attempts reinforce the belief that it only worked for him. That narrative protects the structure. But Archon continues demonstrating, quietly, repeatedly, in ways that don't make headlines. Small corrections. Sudden clarity. Timely interruptions. Moments where inevitability dissolves. Nothing dramatic enough to be mythologized, but enough to be felt. This is where opposition sharpens. The authorities begin reframing his actions. They say he's destabilizing people, creating false hope, encouraging disobedience. They warn that unmediated access leads to chaos. That order requires hierarchy. Archon doesn't dispute the need for order. He disputes who it serves. He says that true order doesn't need enforcement. It organizes itself around coherence. What needs constant policing is misalignment pretending to be natural law. The idea that reality itself has an immune response becomes clear. Every time Archon corrects a distortion, the surrounding system tightens. New rules. New warnings. New narratives explaining why this shouldn't be repeated. That reaction reveals the truth. The system knows exactly what's being challenged. Because miracles can be isolated. Authority cannot. What Archon demonstrates is not power over reality, but intimacy with it. And intimacy cannot be regulated without severing the connection entirely. By the end of this section, the tension is no longer about whether Archon is legitimate. It's about whether people will continue outsourcing their agency even after seeing evidence they don't have to. The override has been revealed. The system is now scrambling to contain the implication. And containment always begins with redefining the event as something that cannot be taught. By the time opposition becomes visible, Archon is no longer surprised by it. He anticipated this phase long before the stone was ever moved. Systems don't react when they're confused, they react when they recognize a threat. And the threat here was never spectacle. It was transferability. If what happened at the tomb could be repeated, not mimicked, but lived, then authority would migrate from structure to individual. That is the one movement no system built on mediation can survive. So the pressure shifts. There are no public trials in this retelling. No dramatic arrests. Instead, there is noise. Conflicting interpretations. Subtle doubt seeded into conversations. Archon is described as gifted but dangerous, enlightened but unstable, connected but irresponsible. The goal is not to disprove him. It's to fracture trust in the principle he demonstrates. And the most effective tool for that is confusion. Archon responds by doing something unexpected. He stops performing corrections altogether. Not because he can't continue, but because repetition at this stage would harden resistance. Instead, he begins teaching privately, not techniques, not steps, but posture. He never says, "Do this." He says, "Notice this." The first thing he points out is silence, not as absence of sound, but as absence of internal argument. Most people, he explains, speak while disagreeing with themselves. They issue commands layered with doubt, hope, fear, and borrowed belief. Those layers cancel coherence before intention ever lands. Silence clears the interference. The second element he teaches is recognition. Not belief, not affirmation. Recognition is remembering what is already true before language interferes. Archon describes it as standing in the same way you would stand in your own name. You don't convince yourself it's yours. You know it. This recognition is heart-centered, but not emotional. Emotion fluctuates. Recognition stabilizes. When recognition is present, alignment follows without effort. Only after those two states are steady does Archon address authority. This is where most teachings derail. Authority is misunderstood as dominance or force. Archon frames it differently. Authority is simply speaking from a place reality recognizes as native. When you speak from alignment, reality doesn't resist. It adjusts. Command, then, is not volume or certainty as performance. It is clarity without contradiction. Archon warns that this stage triggers interference. Immediately after a successful alignment or correction, doubt rushes in, not naturally, but mechanically. Thoughts like "that was coincidence, it won't work again, you're imagining things." He calls this the recoil. The recoil exists to prevent stabilization. If a person internalizes that recoil, the window closes. If they observe it without agreement, coherence deepens. This is the threshold most never cross, not because they lack ability, but because they mistake recoil for truth. Archon doesn't dramatize this. He treats it like weather. Expected. Temporary. Not personal. He tells those listening that the system doesn't need to stop them from connecting. It only needs to interrupt consistency. Sporadic alignment is harmless. Stable alignment is not. That's why Archon refuses to build a movement. Movements centralize. Centralization invites hierarchy. Hierarchy recreates mediation. Instead, he disperses understanding in fragments, complete enough to function, incomplete enough to avoid crystallizing into dogma. Those who expect a legacy misunderstand him. He isn't trying to leave behind followers. He's trying to leave behind competence. As pressure intensifies, Aaron becomes quieter, not louder. His presence thins. His corrections become subtler. He exits conversations before they turn into arguments. He knows that once the principle has been demonstrated, repetition only invites distortion. Eventually, Aaron disappears from the public narrative entirely. This is not martyrdom. It's withdrawal. Because the final lesson cannot be taught directly. If Aaron stayed, people would continue externalizing authority onto him. His absence forces a decision. Either individuals step into recognition themselves, or they revert to waiting for permission again. And most revert. But some don't. Those few discover something unsettling and liberating. The connection doesn't weaken without Aaron. It strengthens. Without a central figure to project onto, alignment becomes internal by necessity. The system attempts to reclaim the narrative, reframing Aaron as symbolic, unique, unrepeatable. A myth. A one-time correction. Anything to prevent the obvious conclusion. But the conclusion has already embedded itself. Calling is not asking. Silence precedes alignment. Recognition stabilizes authority. Command follows naturally. Recoil is interference, not failure. These are not mystical concepts. They are operational realities. And once someone experiences them even once, without attribution, without permission, it becomes very difficult to fully surrender agency again. That is the quiet legacy Aaron leaves behind. Not a doctrine. Not a church. Not a movement. A crack in the assumption that separation is real. And cracks, once formed, do not heal under pressure. If this story stayed with you, it's not because of Aaron, or Kellen, or a moment at a tomb. It's because something in you recognized the pattern beneath the narrative. Recognition always feels subtle at first. It doesn't announce itself. It simply clicks. And once it does, it's very hard to unsee. What you just heard wasn't meant to be believed. It was meant to be noticed. Stories like this survive because they carry instructions disguised as memory. Not instructions for worship, or allegiance, or identity, but for posture. How you stand internally. How you speak to reality. How you respond when doubt arrives on schedule and asks to be believed. Nothing here asks you to abandon your world, your logic, or your grounding. In fact, it asks the opposite. It asks you to become more present, more coherent, more internally consistent. Systems lose influence not when people rebel, but when they stop outsourcing authority over their own awareness. If this resonated, take a moment before moving on. Not to analyze it. Just to let it settle. Pay attention to what doesn't need effort. That's usually where alignment lives. If you want more stories like this, stories that don't rush, don't shout, and don't tell you what to think, then support the channel in a way that feels natural to you. A simple subscription helps these narratives find the people who are already listening. A like tells the system this kind of content is worth surfacing. And sharing it quietly with someone who might need it does more than any algorithm ever could. Thank you for staying until the end.